Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me for the General Principles Review, which is our Section 2 Rules and Regulations module. This module will be used for all of the EnviroCert certifications. Stormwater pollution is both natural or man-made, and it has been around since civilization began. Historically, back in 1500 BC, there were issues with wastewater contamination to their drinking water in Pakistan. You saw cholera outbreaks in Rome, and where it resulted in the aqueducts being constructed to convey clean water. As the Industrial Revolution began through the 19th and 20th century, you began to see greater contributions to the environment, heavy metals and harmful chemicals, radioactive wastes, and organic sludge contaminating the streams, lakes, and oceans. As civilization progressed, so did industrial and other kinds of activities. The result of that, though, became the contribution and generation of hazardous materials and chemical wastes. The explosion of the industrial and commercial activities of the 19th and 20th century exacerbated these issues, and we began to see significant increases in degradation of our water. You can see just lack of understanding and policies that were not foreseen at the time began to contribute to these continued hazards that we see through today. Following our world wars, following the growth of the 1950s, we had several environmental challenges. This really became a significant event when the Cuyahoga rivers started catching fire. They're known as the river fires through the late 1950s and early 1960s. And as we reached into the 1960s and we saw this greater awareness of the environment, which you saw the escalating public outcries known as Earth Day, we started implementing stronger and stronger regulatory controls. It's important to keep in mind that worldwide, 2.5 billion people and growing depend on groundwater, and it's essential that we continue to protect these resources, and stormwater runoff becomes one of the biggest contaminants of these resources. You'll see that as we go through this, we don't talk as much about groundwater, but it's important to recognize the Safe Drinking Water Act and other groundwater rules that were implemented to protect our drinking water resources. Today, you'll see that the U.S. waters, for the reasons I talked about in the past slides, have been subject to water quality degradation over the long run. Urbanization and development activities have increased the amount of impervious surfaces in our watershed. That has led to increased volumes and stormwater rate runoffs. These surfaces potentially contribute to an increase of pollutants being washed off into our receiving waters. Structural and non-structural controls have been evolving over the past decades, as well as a number of hybrid controls to help assist in those activities. Point source pollution has been more and more studied, much greater awareness within the public, and therefore we've been able to much better easily understand and target some of these pollutants. Further regulations are being implemented to put limits on these types of pollution. Non-point source pollution, such as stormwater runoff, require more attention to preventing control practices, and they're much harder to identify, so they've been challenges that have been faced by government agencies trying to implement various regulations. Regulations have been continued to be amended as we've continued to improve our technology. The current approach in the U.S. is to try to better our water pollution controls, which has included the NPDES permit regulations. To offset the increase in water pollution regulations will continue to evolve. You see currently the MS4 permit in most states continuing to grow and place stricter limits on point source and non-point source pollution. The following is going to give you just some high points that EnviroCert's provided for you to get ready for the upcoming exam if you're going to take one of them. There is a very detailed presentation that you will see, and that's available for anybody that is part of your take-home exam. It'll be called the U.S. Rules and Regulation Resource and Study Guide, and it will provide a very detailed and exhaustive review of all of the rules and regs we're going to talk about today, and others that are important that were not included as part of this presentation. Slide 18 in front of you is a brief timeline summary that'll provide you kind of an idea of the progression of some of our laws and regulations that have come into effect through the current time. The following slide here presents really the first significant Water Pollution Act that was implemented in 1948. And as you can see on here, really the two bullet points is it gave the Surgeon General authority to start dealing with interstate waters and tributaries to kind of improve sanitary conditions. The second one gave the FWA the authority to start assisting states and municipalities on treating sewage. Notice the timing of this. This follows World War II. We had a lot of activities, a lot of industrial activities, and now the awareness of us polluting our waters is starting to come into effect. But it's focused at this point on really what's going on with sewage treatment and flood control efforts. As we move into 52, 55, and 61, you'll see that 52 just extended that act for 3 years. 55 actually made it a permanent law. And we started seeing in 61 more about reservoirs and storage. And again, a mention of water quality here. But again, these are really keyed more on dealing with flood control actions. As we move into 1970 and reorganization plans, you'll see this is the establishment of the EPA and actually the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Then in 1972 became really the biggest and most fundamental act we've seen come across. It's the renaming of the Federal Water Act to what we know now as, you'll see CWA as the initials all the time, but the Clean Water Act. And it really became a monumental bright line test about defining water pollution and water pollution controls. Part of this, and there's many things that you'll see that were established by this act that are not covered in this presentation that you'll see in the take-home, but one of the most significant was the NPDES. And there were major goals here. In 1972, they wanted to make sure that we eliminated all discharge of pollution in navigable waters by 1985. Clearly we failed at that because here we are in 2019 and we're still having that same fight. They want at this point, we're trying to protect fish and shellfish and wildlife and recreation. We wanted that accomplished by 83. And we're trying to prohibit any toxics that are going into the water. In 77, we started looking at our discharge, our effluent limitation guidelines started becoming enumerated here. We started using the term, for better or worse, best management practice programs. Okay, authority was given to Fish and Wildlife Services to assist them and for them to develop best management practices. The NERP was completed during this time. It had started in 1977. Here it was published in 78, where they had looked at over 30 sites to start looking at what was going on with urban runoff. Up to this point, and you'll notice in the first 20-something slides that I've given you, it's industrial commercial, and really it's industrial. And all of a sudden, this study brings out an awareness that residential and other activities that were associated with growth now was becoming a major contributor to stormwater pollution, and an awareness all of a sudden of what was going on with impervious surfaces and the types of land uses we had going. By 87, there's the further amendments starting to create different structures to classify stormwater that might be contaminated. They started looking at different methodologies for the types of discharge. And they started trying to establish different permits on how to address each of these problems. So as a result of those identifications and the knowledge that's coming by these studies, as well as really a series of lawsuits, phase one, what we became known as the NPDES program, in 1990 becomes established. They targeted medium to large MS4s, they called them, serving populations of 100,000 or more. They started classifying industrial activities into different categories, and they said anything that had construction activities greater than 5 acres needed to have a permit. This was challenged by many stakeholders and agencies as being too vague, not going far enough. And so as the lawsuits were resolved, consent decrees were implemented, phase two came about in 1999. And now they started dealing with small MS4s, okay, through these special designations. They expand the program considerably. they now start saying, all right, construction activities greater than 1 acre to 5 acres will need to have permits. So as we've talked in the last couple slides, we saw from 1948, where we had the Federal Clean Water Act, we had a series of actions occurring through 72. We see a monumental bright line case occur in 72 with the Clean Water Act. We see, as I mentioned earlier, the generation of different permits by the EPA and then delegation of jurisdiction down to the various states to implement their own individual permits, whether it's construction, municipal, or multi-sector industrial. In comes really a series of cases to the Court of Appeals and up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which became known as the 2006 Rapinoe case. There are a series of issues that were addressed. And as you can see on slide 29 right now, these included, and really not limited to, the traditional navigable waters, wetlands that were adjacent to navigable waters, what was the meaning and what was the definition of non-navigable tributaries of traditional navigable waters. And then they talked about what was going on with wetlands that were directly abutting such tributaries. And this became a monumental case in that it completely changed the way we have viewed these different kinds of waters. In 2006, the Supreme Court hears this case, and now they start reviewing the Clean Water Act of 72 and the subsequent cases, and they now come back and they start agreeing on what the terms of waters of the U.S. are in their case, and remand it back down. The EPA takes these directions and start establishing guidelines. And you'll see here on slide 31 where they're going to start asserting certain jurisdictions over traditional navigable waters and what that jurisdiction will be. Wetlands adjacent to these, non-navigable areas, and wetlands that abut, which is the same list you saw a little bit earlier. But what they also went on to say here was trying to further define and limit, and some would argue expand, jurisdiction over these. And they started using really what was a significant nexus, as whether they had that or not. There has to be a showing of that nexus over these traditional navigable waters. The courts and the EPA now start also deciding in 2007 that they're not going to assert jurisdiction over swales or erosional features. They're not going to look at ditches, which includes roadside ditches, whether they're excavated wholly or just in draining of upland areas. The EPA 2007 Rapinoe guidelines also showed where they were going to apply jurisdiction. If the test showed there was a significant nexus, then they can assert jurisdiction where they assess flow characteristics and the function of the tributary itself and the functions performed by the adjacent wetlands to have a significant effect on, going back to the term they used in the Clean Water Act, the chemical, physical, and biologic integrity of the downstream traditional navigable waters. They also could show a significant nexus and assert jurisdiction if there's overriding hydrologic and ecologic factors that need to be considered. As we moved into 2008 and they had more comments, they started clarifying what traditional navigable waters were. You'll see the acronym TNW used. There was some clarifications on what the term adjacent wetlands meant. The public comments from the EPA Rapinoe's 2008 review also provided some additional clarification on some terms that you see on slide 36. And there was some further definition of what traditional navigable waters was. They clarified some of the regulatory terms on adjacent wetlands, and they further tried to refine what relevant reach means. This case by no means is over. This will be continued to be debated and evaluated. So as we present this to you, don't think this was clarified and is cut in stone, and it's not. And we'll continue to see much debate about this particular case. So over the next several slides here, I'm not going to read these terms to you, but these are some terms and definitions that you should make sure that you're familiar with as you move forward to the rest of the modules that we've presented. You'll see that we've given you the terms that are really based on the federal definition here as we talk about pollution or pollutants. And so make sure that you go through your reference book, you read these, try to be familiar with them as we talk about what discharge points are, navigable waters, point sources, etc. as we move through here. If these are terms that you've never read, I strongly suggest that you go out and do a little bit of research. Remember, this program, as we're looking at these terms, and I'm just going to kind of take you through them, is based on your education and experience. So what we're giving you are some terms that you should be familiar with, that we think that you need to be aware of, just as you understand it. But it's very important that you go out on your own here and treat this as just really some high point definitions as we're talking about them, and that you make sure you've got a thorough understanding for the exam. And again, some of these you'll see we gave you this information like in 86 for the waters of the U.S. We try to give you a date because of the Rapinos case changing them. So try to make sure you're familiar with these as you read them, as I mentioned. So we go through these. And at the end here, we're giving you some acronyms like best available technology, best management practices, and for those of you that have been in the industry a while, you know those are always the subject of great debate. Best practice control technology, etc. So again, make sure you're familiar with these acronyms and go through them very thoroughly, and you should be able to readily understand and recognize them. So thank you very much for joining me today and going over the rules and regs. Again, please feel free to refer back to the U.S. Rules and Reg resource book that we do provide. If you have any questions or comments, please make sure that you send us an email on the address that's provided here on the slide. Make sure you make a note that this is Rules and Regs Section 2. And again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.